The woodshed behind Grace Turner's cabin looked almost empty. That was exactly how she wanted it. Whenever neighbors passed along the trail, they laughed. Poor Grace barely has enough firewood for a week. Others shook their heads. She's going to freeze before Christmas. Grace never corrected them, because the real woodshed wasn't above ground. It was hidden beneath it. 3 years earlier, Grace had nearly died during a mountain blizzard. A fallen pine crushed her tiny cabin while she slept. Only the crawl space beneath the floor kept her alive until neighbors dug her out 2 days later. Lying beneath broken beams, listening to the storm rage overhead, she made herself one promise. If she ever built another home, she would build the safest room first. Everything else could wait. The following spring, she bought an abandoned homestead on the edge of Cedar Pass. The cabin needed repairs. The old woodshed behind it leaned badly after years of neglect. Most people planned to tear it down. Grace saw something different. The woodshed already sat on a gentle rise above the surrounding ground. Perfect drainage. Firm soil. Exactly where a hidden shelter belonged. She spent the summer digging. Every evening after working in town, she carried out another bucket of earth. Slowly, quietly, the excavation reached 8 feet below ground. Then 10. She lined the walls with hand-cut fieldstone, installed thick cedar beams overhead, covered everything with heavy oak planks before rebuilding the woodshed exactly where it had stood before. From outside, nothing looked unusual. Inside the woodshed, one corner held a neat stack of firewood. Another stored tools. Only Grace knew one section of floor lifted upward. Beneath it waited a sturdy ladder. Her hidden shelter measured nearly 12 feet square, large enough for several people. A small cast-iron stove stood against one wall. Ventilation pipes disappeared upward inside 2 hollow woodshed posts. Fresh air entered through a buried stone drain extending downhill. Smoke escaped through a disguised chimney hidden beside the stovepipe used to dry tools. Every detail served 2 purposes: warmth and secrecy. One afternoon, neighbor Frank Collins wandered into the woodshed. He frowned at the tiny pile of logs. "You'd better start chopping." Grace smiled. "I have enough." He laughed. "I've heated cabins for 30 years. That won't last until January." She simply nodded. "I appreciate the concern." Frank left, shaking his head. The rumors spread quickly. Grace had become careless. Some believed she had grown lazy. Others thought money had become too tight to buy firewood. Only Martha Jennings, the oldest woman in town, seemed unconvinced. "You've always prepared early." Grace smiled. "I still do." Martha looked around the nearly empty woodshed. "Then where's your wood?" Grace only winked. "Someplace dry." During autumn, Grace quietly carried seasoned oak beneath the woodshed. Not stacked tightly. She left narrow air gaps between every row. The underground room stayed cool, dry, and surprisingly stable. She added barrels of fresh water, shelves filled with dried vegetables, salted beef, blankets, medical supplies, lanterns, candles. By October, nearly 3 months of provisions rested beneath the innocent-looking woodshed. Above ground, visitors saw only a few scattered logs. One crisp afternoon, while enlarging a storage shelf beneath the shelter, Grace's shovel struck solid timber. She frowned. The shelter hadn't existed before summer. What was Wood doing beneath it? Carefully brushing away dirt, she uncovered an old trapdoor. Iron hinges still clung to weathered oak. Curiosity overcame caution. She lifted it slowly. Cold air drifted upward, along with the faint smell of cedar. Lantern in hand, Grace climbed down a narrow ladder. The chamber below looked far older than her shelter. Stone walls, heavy beams blackened by age, wooden shelves carved directly into the rock. Someone had built this place generations earlier. A faded journal rested on a table covered with dust. The first page bore a name: Thomas Whitaker, 1881. Grace settled onto an old bench and began reading. Thomas had been one of the first settlers through Cedar Pass. His journal described a devastating winter that trapped several families for nearly 2 weeks. After surviving, he secretly built the underground refuge beneath what later became the woodshed. Not to hide from neighbors, to protect anyone who needed shelter. One sentence caught Grace's attention. "Most people prepare for hunger. Few prepare for falling roofs." She looked upward instinctively. The journal continued. Thomas described strengthening the chamber with massive cedar beams, adding ventilation, digging an emergency escape tunnel leading toward the nearby creek. Grace frowned. Escape tunnel? She searched the room carefully. Behind one shelf, she discovered a narrow stone doorway nearly hidden beneath loose boards. The passage beyond remained surprisingly intact. Lantern held high, she followed it. The tunnel stretched nearly 60 feet beneath the hillside. Timber supports still looked solid despite their age. Eventually, she reached another hidden exit concealed beneath a hollow fallen log beside the frozen creek. Grace smiled. Now the shelter had two entrances. If snow buried one, the other remained. She spent several weeks repairing the forgotten tunnel, replacing rotten supports, clearing fallen rocks, strengthening weak sections. By early November, the underground refuge had become far safer than she ever imagined possible. Meanwhile, life in Cedar Pass continued normally. Hunters still ventured into the mountains. Farmers delayed cutting extra firewood. Merchants expected another mild autumn. Then one evening, while hauling the final load of supplies underground, Grace noticed something strange. The wind had gone completely silent. Not calm, silent. Even the birds disappeared. Clouds rolled over the western peaks unusually fast. She had seen that silence only once before. 3 years earlier, just before the blizzard that destroyed her first cabin. The next morning, she urged several neighbors to finish winter preparations immediately. Most smiled politely. It's only November. Grace looked toward the mountains. I don't think winter cares what month it is. That night, the temperature dropped 25 degrees. Before dawn, snow began falling harder than anyone in Cedar Pass had seen in years. By sunrise, Cedar Pass had disappeared. Snow buried fences. The road into town vanished beneath drifts taller than a horse. The wind roared without pause. Grace stood inside the woodshed, listening. Above her, loose boards rattled violently. She lifted the hidden trapdoor, climbed down the ladder, then closed it carefully behind her. Almost instantly, the noise faded. The thick earth surrounding the shelter swallowed the storm. She lit the cast iron stove. Within minutes, the underground room filled with gentle warmth. The carefully stacked firewood burned perfectly dry. Fresh air flowed steadily through the hidden ventilation pipes. The shelter worked exactly as she had hoped. Outside, the blizzard only grew stronger. By afternoon, desperate pounding echoed faintly through the woodshed floor. Grace climbed the ladder. When she forced open the woodshed door, Frank Collins nearly fell inside. Snow covered him from hat to boots. Our roof collapsed. Grace didn't hesitate. Bring your family. Frank stared. Where? She quietly lifted the trapdoor. His eyes widened. You've been hiding this under the woodshed? She smiled. I've been preparing. Within an hour, Frank returned with his wife and 2 children. The little family climbed into the shelter. The children immediately settled onto the wooden bunks beside the warm stove. Frank looked around in disbelief. Shelves filled with food, water barrels, blankets, dry firewood. Everything had its place. You planned for this. Grace nodded. I hoped I'd never need it. The next morning, another knock came. Then another. Martha Jennings arrived supporting an injured neighbor. A young couple followed carrying their newborn daughter. By evening, 12 people occupied the underground refuge. Nobody felt crowded. The old chamber Thomas Whitaker had built doubled the available space. Children slept in the older room. Adults rested in Grace's newer shelter. The ventilation system continued drawing fresh mountain air without letting warmth escape. On the 3rd day, a violent crash shook the ground. Everyone froze. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Grace climbed quietly through the trapdoor. The woodshed still stood, but barely. A massive pine had fallen across one side of the roof. Had the shelter been built directly beneath the cabin instead of the smaller woodshed, the damage could have been far worse. The old settler's choice subtly made perfect sense. The woodshed carried less weight. If it failed, the underground room could survive. Grace returned below. We're safe. The frightened faces slowly relaxed. That afternoon, she explored the emergency tunnel to inspect the second exit. Halfway through, she discovered part of the passage blocked by fallen earth. Working carefully with Frank, she cleared the obstruction before nightfall. Now both exits remained usable. Thomas Whitaker had been right. One escape route was never enough. Food remained plentiful. Everyone took only what they needed. Children helped carry firewood from the storage shelves. Martha organized meals. Frank repaired damaged bunks using spare lumber Grace had stored months earlier. The shelter became more than a hiding place. It became a home. On the sixth morning, Grace remembered Thomas's journal. She searched the older chamber again. This time she noticed one loose stone beneath the table. Behind it rested a small iron box. Inside lay folded property records, letters, and one final note written by Thomas himself. If this shelter saves another family someday, then every hour spent digging it was worthwhile. Grace folded the note carefully. It already has. The storm finally ended after 8 relentless days. Grace climbed through the tunnel leading toward the creek. Sunlight poured through the hidden exit. The valley looked almost unfamiliar. Several roofs had collapsed. The church bell tower leaned dangerously. Entire woodpiles had disappeared beneath enormous drifts. Rescue crews from a neighboring settlement arrived 2 days later. They found every family from Grace's shelter alive. When they asked how 12 people had survived such a storm, Frank simply pointed toward the ordinary-looking woodshed. No, he smiled. Look underneath it. The county engineer spent an afternoon examining the underground refuge. He carefully measured the stone walls, ventilation shafts, drainage, the emergency tunnel. Finally, he removed his hat. This wasn't luck. Grace shook her head. It was built from experience. Spring brought rebuilding across Cedar Pass. The town council gathered outside the repaired schoolhouse. The mayor addressed the crowd. We've always built woodsheds. He looked toward Grace. From now on, we'll build shelters beneath them. The proposal passed without a single objection. Throughout the summer, neighbors dug underground rooms beneath their own woodsheds. Grace helped every family. She showed them how to lay stone walls, create natural ventilation, build emergency exits, keep supplies dry. She never accepted payment. Only another pair of willing hands on the next shelter. Months later, Martha Jennings handed Grace a weathered wooden sign. Carved into the cedar were simple words. Turner's Shelter. Grace smiled gently. This belongs to everyone. Martha nodded. That's exactly why it carries your name. Years afterward, travelers crossing Cedar Pass noticed something unusual. Every woodshed looked ordinary. Neatly stacked firewood. Simple timber walls. Nothing remarkable. Only the people living there knew each one concealed something far more valuable beneath the floor. Not a secret. A second chance. People often remembered the great blizzard for the destruction it caused. Grace remembered it for something else. It proved that the strongest shelter isn't always the one everyone can see. Sometimes, the wisest protection is built quietly beneath ordinary things, long before anyone realizes they'll need it.